The very beginning of the 5th console generation is one of the most fascinating times to look back on. Without preset conventions or standards for 3D game design, most developers had to figure out gaming in the third dimension on the fly, leading to an era of games that seem almost alien to us today. There were no rules, laws, or standards, so different developers had different ways to interpret every basic action, from controlling a camera to combating enemies to fucking walking in a straight line. And while practically all early 2D to 3D efforts had some difficulty adjusting to the Z-axis, none struggled to find their footing more than the 2D action platformer. You see, the slick action platformers of yesteryear centered around mastering controls and besting a series of quick reactionary challenges. But with hardware that oftentimes struggled to keep a constant frame rate, and the difficulty most games had in creating engaging combat in the third dimension, those kinds of snappy, skill-based platformers oftentimes turned turgid and sluggish when they went 3D. Which is probably why one of 2D's most competent action game contenders, Mega Man, chose to focus its attention elsewhere when making the transition to 3D. Thus, enter Mega Man Legends, an action-adventure game with a focus on exploration in a slowly unfolding 3D world, in place of the precision platforming and challenging combat of the Mega Man's Classic and X. That's a change that's probably hard to understand until you actually play it, because it's a whole lot harder to picture a successful action game being made with these controls. Making a quality 3D action game probably doesn't seem as difficult now as it did back then. Years of stacking gameplay innovations have made the action game genre fairly homogenous today, but in a time when there was no golden standard, Mega Man Legends was an acceptable and earnest attempt at 3D action. But that doesn't mean I'd really qualify it as good. Even back in 1997, it wasn't the most elegant game, but now it's hard to see this as anything other than a jank-infested nightmare. For one, the camera doesn't seem to give a shit about walls or distance. The camera will always stay at the exact same distance behind Mega Man, no matter what is in front of or behind you, meaning it'll clip through walls and solid objects indiscriminately. You can peek inside of buildings to see they're nothing but hollow, empty architecture, and rotate the camera through level geometry to reveal that every room in this colorful, quirky world is just an illusion, and the existential horror of this fictional reality is that everything is merely a set of 4 walls floating in an endless black void. But those kinds of quirks were to be expected in early 3D games. And they're not the main reason a lot of them feel so janky and weird to play today. The bigger issues here are how the awkward, primitive tank controls of Legends ultimately affects the design of the game itself. A game has to be built around the player's controls and abilities, and in a rigid, restrictive game like Mega Man Legends, you're forced to make a lot of concessions in level and enemy design as a crutch. The levels lack traps or obstacles, and the majority of them don't even have much platforming, or really make a whole lot of use of vertical space. When you're not exploring straight and narrow hallways, you're exploring large, empty chambers with little to no changes in elevation. And that's likely because these controls and mechanics don't lend themselves very well to nimble, precision platforming. But it's the enemies who suffer the most from this game's controls. Since Mega Man Volnut can barely move his blue metal ass, the enemies are designed to be as immobile and passive as possible to compensate. If you want to win any fight, no matter what part of the game you're in, you can do it by circle strafing around whatever's in front of you, because it somehow takes them longer to turn around than it takes you. And it's interesting to think the developers noticed all these camera and control issues and chose to just design around them, rather than actively try to fix them. I can't help but wonder if the shift in genre was due not just to artistic vision, but to Kawano and his team recognizing that these controls just wouldn't suit an action game. But perhaps that was a bit of a happy accident, since Mega Man Legends makes up for its lack of polish and action with sheer, unfiltered, unabashed creativity, which shows up in a lot of unexpected places. I talked a lot of shit about the game's basic combat, but there's still a hell of a lot to like in that regard. When you're not hammering square at basic enemies, you're tackling towering foes, or participating in unique combat challenges that exude the type of creativity that makes Mega Man Legends an experience worth talking about. While there's not a whole lot of verticality to the level design, that's probably because the creative elements involving the Z-axis went to fighting bosses, who oftentimes have you leaping around the arena to reach weak spots, or using natural terrain to scale high enough to get the angle on the enemy. Flat environments and bland, uninteresting rooms characterize the majority of the game's basic level structures, but in between what should be the main event are these special instance levels that are a hell of a lot more interesting, both in concept and in execution, than any of the game's major dungeons. These missions have you defending a tower while holding off a wave of enemies, who can permanently level buildings that you'll have to pay to have repaired. You'll be racing through maze-like streets, chasing after and laying down traps for a pack of boss enemies holding a key you need to progress. You'll be managing a barrage of battleships or airship cannons in the hopes of sinking them before they sink you. A lot of those action set pieces would go on to be some of the most common in the coming generation. In fact, Legends is an oddly prophetic gameplay experience, featuring a number of design trends that would become incredibly popular in future games. And it's interesting to see them done so strangely here. The most noteworthy of which was Legends' use of light RPG elements in an action game setting. The system here has you swapping out tools and character upgrades to assist you in basic combat, and while it acts as little more than a band-aid on basic enemies, it gives those boss fights a much needed, if not somewhat shallow, strategic edge. Mega Man's Buster is limited and weak from the start of the game, but can be powered up with various Buster parts. The real kicker here is that Buster parts aren't permanent upgrades. Rather than spending EXP points to permanently boost your stats, the parts instead act as temporary modifiers to increase the 4 basic stats of Mega Man's Buster. It's a neat idea, but it's a bit understated in the grand scheme of things. The amount of enemies who you'll be forced to adjust your Buster stats for are minuscule at best, and the hierarchy of stats and their usefulness basically means prioritizing attack power is the key to success most of the time. But what actually does really affect combat is what I would consider to be the game's biggest feature: special weapons. The special weapons offer much needed variety to your basic combat abilities, to the point where your entire playstyle is likely to center around using the ones you enjoy most. But all the weapons are unique enough that they warrant at least some use, especially weapons like the Grand Grenade and Drill Arm, which aren't used for combat so much as they're used for situational purposes like destroying walls. But most interestingly, one of the biggest influences the special weapons have on the game is not how they affect combat, but more how their mere existence kind of justifies the design and format of Mega Man Legends. It costs money to upgrade them, and to get money, you'll need to participate in combat and explore thoroughly in dungeons and underground tunnels, and the parts and schematics for them are obtained through the completion of side content. Thus, collecting special weapons essentially turns into a long-running side quest that fuels a ton of the player's own exploration. That's a big keyword for this game, by the way. Exploration. Mega Man Legends, for all its focus on awkward early-era 3D combat, is an adventure game first and foremost. It plays a hell of a lot like a Zelda clone, which is kind of shocking when you consider the fact that Legends came out a full year before the first 3D Zelda game. The world of Mega Man Legends is this ever-unfolding daisy chain of content, hidden just behind a breakable wall you don't have the means to tear down yet, or a jump that's slightly too high for your current equipment. And the game funnels you forward in such a way that you're constantly seeking new upgrades so you can explore more and go further. The game's structure is largely linear, following a straight line from dungeon to dungeon until you reach the game's final boss, and there's very little meat in between, so the side content is really all there is to do in between story-related events. This means that you're allowed, and encouraged, to freely explore the mysteries of the island in between major dungeons. And the side quests themselves involve everything from fetch quests to mini-games, which are fairly standard, sure, but it's the density of them that impresses me. At any moment, a new side quest could just unlock, and to find it, you just have to talk to however many people it takes until you find the next trigger that'll unlock the next quest. And as stated before, since much of your quest completion is based on finding and obtaining new weapons, the quests themselves offer smaller rewards that act as building blocks to larger rewards the more you complete them. There's this one quest that involves getting lipstick for a painter, which, once you complete it, rather than being given a reward, you gain access to the museum, which becomes the center of a much larger side quest that involves collecting a series of rare artifacts underground or through the completion of other side quests that ends with you obtaining one of 3 parts essential to completing the ultimate weapon. But when you're not escorting pregnant women to the hospital to obtain machine gun parts, you're exploring the various mysterious underground tunnels beneath Catalog's Island. The tunnels are a network of connecting corridors and rooms loaded with treasures to find, from buster parts to quest items to weapon parts. And the further along you are in the game, the further you can explore the tunnels. By the end of the game, the tunnels will span 4 whole maps and connect with literally every single area of the game, from the dungeons below to the world above. Hidden behind a few destructible walls, just a few rooms away from the first underground tunnel in the game is an entrance to the final dungeon, and you would never have access to that shortcut unless you obtain the drill arm, which is conveniently found within said final dungeon, and that really blew my mind the first time. The amount of secrets and details packed into such a condensed space is honestly a delight to discover, and it really goes to show that Mega Man Legends put the majority of its focus into creating the world of the game rather than the gameplay within that game. The fictional island of Catalox is a bustling center of activity, with busy streets, and a town sectioned off into various lively and vibrant areas, and the whole place is densely, obsessively packed with detail. Each and every single area is fully realized, filled with things to gawk at and NPCs to interact with. You can find porno mags on the shelf of the bookstore, or listen to music in the CD shop. You can kick a can into a trash bin for money, and the actual can has actual can physics that have it sputtering on the ground like a real world can, and that's just absurd for an early 3D effort. But it's those little details that make the whole thing come to life. The city above is both vibrant and colorful, which stands in contrast to the flip side of this coin, the main dungeons, which are oppressive and foreboding. The underground dungeons are these creepy, haunting monuments of the past, filled with droning music and ambient, piercing silence that makes the whole thing a hell of a lot scarier than you might expect. The ruins and tunnels are both far too old and decrepit to be new, but have a mechanical and technological design to them that makes it clear these areas were made by more advanced civilizations, and those intricate details go a long way towards making the world of Legends a world worth discovering. Legends' world naturally inspires a sense of mystery and exploration, which teases a story about an ancient alien civilization, an entire realm of secrets hidden just beneath your very feet. And the irony of this obsessively detailed world, whose mere existence implies a story far grander than you can imagine, is how little of a story there actually is. The mysteries it teases are merely that. Teases, interweaved into a fairly standard stop the bad guys plot. The mystery of the Reaverbots, the strange alien civilization that holds the fate of humanity in its hands, the whereabouts of Roll's parents, and even the origins of Mega Man Walnut himself are all left partially or totally unanswered as the game draws to a close. And frankly, I think nothing summarizes the experience of playing Mega Man Legends better than its paper-thin story. It's chock full of unique concepts, none of which are polished or fully fledged enough to be truly remarkable. And that's because Legends is an experiment. It was first to the races in the implementation of a lot of ideas, but it wasn't spit-shined and polished enough to ever be fully realized, which I think makes Mega Man Legends a hell of a lot more interesting to play now than it ever was back in 1997, because it's the byproduct of an era of game design that was all about throwing shit at the wall and seeing what sticks. And a lot of your enjoyment of the game will depend on how much you can appreciate that. Personally, I think it's just adorable. It's a janky, messy experiment that's got enough charm and creativity to make the whole trip worthwhile. And it's interesting to see some incredibly early attempts at what other games would end up refining and turning into gameplay trends. After all, games age in fascinating ways. Sometimes, there's brilliance underneath the gunked up graphics or primitive gameplay of classic games, and Mega Man Legends is a shining example of a game bursting with creativity hidden just behind a daunting wall of crudeness. So, much like the intrepid adventurers of Mega Man Legends' world, the only way to discover the mysteries hidden within these relics of the past is to dig in deep and explore.
この番組はご覧のスポンサーの提供でお送りしました。